Well, a very good afternoon from my side. It is very afternoon here, Kristina. Before we start, is it okay that we record this interview?
Yes, no problem at all.
All right, thank you. First of all, please tell us. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Nurmala. I'm the lead coordinator for EMI research section at English Language Internationalization or ELINET network. So, first of all, can you tell us about yourself, name, work, and the role you are in? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much, Nurmala. It's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you very much for inviting me to do this interview. So my name is Kristina Hultgren, and I am Professor of Sociolinguistics and Applied Linguistics at the Open University in the School of Languages and Applied Linguistics. And I'm also a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow, which means that I'm currently leading, actually two research projects on English as a medium of instruction, but one of them is funded by the UKRI and the other one by the British Council.
Okay, thank you. So glad to always hearing about someone's working on EMI, project on EMI. Okay, well, talking about the research that you are in now, before I asked the second questions, is your project, I mean, at least most of the project that you are in are based in Europe?
So I'm working on one project which is exploring the drivers of English as a medium of instruction in European higher education. And then the other project I'm leading is focusing on low and middle income contexts and doing case studies in Nepal and Nigeria.
Okay, so I need to be flexible at this time. As the following questions more about the context of research that you are working on, and I know that you have done so many kind of extensive research on this area. So would you prefer that we are going to talk about the one in Nepal or in European?
We could talk a little bit about them both. I suppose I'm more engrossed, a bit further advanced with the European one, and it's a bigger project as well. I've got 4 postdocs working with me on that project, and yeah, we're a bit further ahead, and it's it's a longer project that runs for 4 years. So yeah, that's probably the one that's possibly more interesting. The other one's also interesting, I hope.
Yeah, of course, that I have read some articles that you published. That's actually I learned about European context, some from your publication. So we continue with the European context then. So do you think that EMI, English medium instruction, plays an important role in higher education in European countries? And
Yeah,
why?
very much so.
Okay.
Yeah, and why? Well, very much so. There's been several attempts at tracking the growth of English as a medium of instruction, which is obviously quite difficult because it also depends on how you define EMI. But the general consensus is that yes, there has been a significant rise of English as a medium of instruction in European higher education since around the turn of the millennium, probably where it really started escalating, but even before that. And actually, this project that I'm leading, which is called Elemental, which is an acronym that stands for English as a Language of Education Mechanisms in Europe, New Transdisciplinary Approaches in Linguistics, aims at exploring why this drive happens. This seems like an obvious question to some. We already know why English as a medium of instruction happens. It's to do with universities competing and collaborating with one another, and English is already a lingua franca, so it's quite natural for universities to also adopt that as a way of collaborating with one another. But what we're proposing on our project is that actually there's a lot more for us to understand about why European universities adopt English. So we're proposing that engaging in transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary collaboration could bring about some new and much so far obscured understandings of why universities switch to English. So what we're doing is that we're bringing to the fore academic governance. This is not something that has featured a lot in applied linguistics and sociolinguistic research on English as a medium of instruction to date. And to do that properly, we're engaging with theories and methodologies from other disciplines, notably political science, but also related fields such as higher education studies and public administration. So these are people that know a lot about academic governance and governance theories more generally. And we're also trying to adopt some of the methods that they would typically use to study how decision-making processes work and the consequences that they have. So one of our hypotheses are that the rise of English happens because there were some governance reforms which started from around the early 1980s in Europe that decided to grant universities much greater autonomy than they had previously had. So most universities in Europe are publicly funded and have been under the governance of the higher education ministry. But that changed in the neoliberal era of Thatcher and Reagan, so that universities were given more autonomy. And that was in order to kind of make them more proactive and more dynamic and more cost effective. And we're hypothesizing that that switch, those reforms actually led to driving English as a medium of instruction. And we do have some evidence to suggest that might have played a role in it. So, I mean, some might say that that's not particularly surprising because, as I said, we already know that English is interlinked with the neoliberal ideologies such as enhancing competition and global trade. But we're trying to dig a little bit deeper here and finding out, who actually makes decision about EMI implementation and how and why do they do that more precisely? And how does the nation state and the institution interact in the implementation of EMI? Sometimes we don't often know, is it actually the government that decides to implement EMI or is it the institutions themselves, or is it both of them in an interactive sort of way? And to understand that, we need to understand about multi-level governance and these concepts that have been devised by political scientists and others in public administration. And we're also considering whether decisions about EMI are even explicitly made. Is it somebody who actually says, let's introduce EMI in this institution? Or do they rather happen as a kind of indirect result of other priorities in academic governance, such as international recruitment, internationalization strategies, ambitions to advance on ranking lists, and so on and so forth? And is it even possible to link EMI to those other processes? So this is what we're toying with at the moment on our project.
Very interesting. I have to share a little bit my experience when starting to do research on EMI, and then I quoted quite many the context from Europe, and then you started your explanation just now. Many researcher, I think one of them, including me, that have limited understanding which context that you're referring when you say EMI. So I learned one of the publication of yours, and it helped me now to be carefully when I want to say a certain context. So talking about Europe, I learned a lot from Europe, but I understand a lot as well that especially from Asia, we need to think more carefully when we adopt some conceptual framework that was applied by a research like you're doing. Actually, I was like listening if it is applicable to our context to learn about that. So far, we learned that Bologna process is the keyword that we understand from Europe, but now you are going in depth. So it is very I can imagine that I look forward to hearing more or reading the report later on. So is it the second when did you start this project?
So this project started in November 2020, and we're coming up to 3 years now, and we've got 1 year left.
Okay. So I can still go on with my next questions. Would you share some key findings from the current project that you're working on?
Yes, let's think about that. So I think so we have both a quantitative study and then also some more in-depth case studies in different European countries. And the evidence of the quantitative studies is that there does seem to be a correlation between universities that have more autonomy and the existence of English taught programs. So in that sense, there is preliminary evidence of how our hypothesis being confirmed. But obviously, then our individual case studies, which are taking place in Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, Turkey, and some other countries still to be decided, they reveal a complex, nationally contextualized picture. So while they all we can all link it to some kind of reform that has taken place that has sought to grant universities greater autonomy, there's also a great deal of national cultural variation. So in Italy, for instance, and also in the Netherlands to some extent, there's been a lot of resistance towards English as a medium of instruction. So there have been some challenges to implementing it at various institutions more or less successfully. So it's very important, and it also ties back to what you were saying earlier about context, how important that is, because EMI will look very different according to the different contexts you're looking at, whether that's a national context or also whether you're looking at primary, secondary, or tertiary educational levels. Sometimes there's a tendency, I think, to conflate these different educational contexts, but in fact, the motivations for implementing EMI looks very different in each of these, and also the consequences that it would have, and also, of course, huge disciplinary variation across different disciplines and fields. So that word context is so important to keep in mind when we talk about EMI.
Okay. Before my last questions, I'm curious about the issue of, is there any issue coming up from especially for in-depth research phase that you are in terms of the using of other languages than English? Is there any issue or maybe topic that coming up from the findings of your research, like talking about nationality, like Dutch language should be there?
So, I mean, it's not something we're explicitly looking at so much, but I guess the whole project, especially the European one, came about because of a lot of debates that had been going on in the Nordic countries about the protection and safeguarding of national local languages. So they were seen as being encroached upon by the introduction of English. And I think these are debates that go on across the world, both in outside of academia, but also inside of academia. What's interesting to me is that it's often the ideological discussions, really, and is not something that can be empirically that's not very easily empirically evidenced. Is a language actually threatened or not, or is it being extinct or not? I mean, we know that a language dies every day, or what it is that they usually cite. So clearly languages are under threat, but but I kind of lost my thread. But I think, these discussions, these ideological discussions about threats to different languages, they happen a lot, I think, when we debate English as a medium of instruction. I think it's important to analyze them, or I guess one way of analyzing them is in a context of language ideologies, where people are discussing language as a proxy for some other aspects that they might be concerned about. So whether that's to do with threats from globalization or internationalization, or things just look different from when they were children. And yeah, so they're kind of tied in with other ideologies you hold about how the world should be and not be.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's always interesting, especially talking about the special topic, yeah, about nationalities and the use of English. Come to my last question at this stage, yeah. Yeah, based on your experience and then your research, especially research on EMI, do you think that students in university in Europe have to write their thesis in English? And why do you think so? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess it's not for me to say, but that there's a big discussion about it. So if they want to reach an international audience, then the obvious answer would be to write it in English. So English is the lingua franca in academia, so that will make sense.
Mhm.
I would. There's been some work done by a scholar called Linus Solö, a Swedish scholar, and he has argued for the fact that it's important for theses that are written in English in Sweden, which is where he's based, to have an abstract that is in Swedish. Okay, so that will kind of promote a parallel lingual language ideology or language policy, whereby you make sure that the key messages in academic scholarship are also simultaneously produced in the local or national language. So that's one pragmatic way of going about it. I would also, I guess I would also argue in line with those, well, translingual scholarship who say that, who would argue that languages are ideological or political constructions. And actually, it doesn't matter so much which language you use, but it matters more what you have to say. So they prioritize communication over a particular language. And this is important because even though your thesis is actually written in English, then that should not necessarily stop you from actually communicating the content of that thesis to a different audience, whether or not that's in English or in a different language. So say if you translate your thesis into lay language or popular language, that can be then either English or it could be for the local community of scholars, whether that's Swedish, Danish, or Swahili or something else. So there's a translation process going on, whether that's a translation between different languages or whether it's a translation between academic discourse and more popular lay discourse. And I think that's probably the key here, to understand that we as long as we make sure that we cater for all the audiences, that's the most important thing, more important possibly than the language that we're using. So we could argue, that in many countries in Europe, universities are funded by taxpayers. So taxpayers should be entitled to actually have access to the knowledge that is produced in universities. And so it makes sense for them to be able to benefit from that, and therefore it should be encouraged, and maybe there should even be incentive structures in place to encourage researchers to actually disseminate their research in lay terms and popular terms to a national audience as well, or a popular audience.
It's very interesting, yeah, to see the link, the importance of disseminating what we have been doing during our study. Okay, thank you so much. Such insightful, truly speaking. That's all for now. On behalf of ELINET, I'd like to say thank you.
Well,